Welcome to the Red Bull Theater Podcast, where guests discuss all things classical theater with your host, Nathan Winkelstein.
Welcome to the Red Bull Theater Podcast. My name is Nathan Winkelstein, and I am your host. And I am so thrilled to welcome today the chair of the prestigious NYU Grad acting program, as well as the associate artistic director of Classical Theatre of Harlem, the renowned director and teacher, CARL COFIELD. Hi, CARL. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the pod.
It is my absolute pleasure, and thank you so much for the invite.
Oh, of course. I was so thrilled that you would be able to join me for this. So today we're going to be talking about Macbeth using the famous tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech to jump off that conversation. What is your history with this play?
I directed it for the Classical Theatre of Harlem a few years ago, so got a time to grapple with it and to really engage with it. So that is my only experience with it. As an actor, I was never in it, but just had the privilege of directing it.
Well, that's great. We've had lots of actors on the program. We've had a couple of directors, but I am, as a director myself, I'm always very interested to hear from a director's perspective how we attack these plays. So that'll be very exciting. Now, I do know that you have a little bit of history way back when as an actor, so hopefully it's not too much strain to ask you to, for our listeners, to give us this short tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech as a jumping off point for the conversation. And if that's okay with you, whenever you're ready.
Great, here we go. She should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
Thank you. One of the hardest speeches is just jump right into the end of his story a little bit.
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
Absolutely. And so I to not make the mistake of any podcast ever, for those of you who are listening, I tend to assume that you know the basic story of Macbeth, but if you do not, this is actually the end, very near the end of the play, right after Macbeth has learned that his wife, Lady Macbeth, we actually never learn her first name, has killed herself. And this is his response to that after an entire play that's really built around their relationship. And I think it is fair to say that one of the elements of this play that is so entrancing for audiences and artists alike is this relationship between the Macbeths. And that's the end of it, but there is, of course, a beginning and a middle as well. How did you approach, when you were directing it, how did you approach this relationship? There's lots to be delved there.
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, it was that existential moment where time sort of collapses or expands, depending how you're looking at it. For those who don't know, the entire story is set upon this trajectory of ambition and driving forward. And this is a real moment of time being, in my thoughts, just suspended for this massive, massive existential question about what is it all? And to me, that vaulting ambition that is discussed in the play comes to this giant Grand Canyon of what is it all? So for me, it was really about time compression.
And it's an interesting way of thinking about it, because you're right. It feels like I've never had this image in my head before, and I think about this play a lot. But sort of that very cinematic moment of like when the car crash hits and everything slows down. and we see everything in hyper slow motion. It's almost like that happens to Macbeth, because right before this, he's in mania land. To
Yep.
some, like, he's as sort of manically driving as we've ever seen him in the piece, and then this just seems to stop him in his tracks. When people talk about Macbeth, there's a lot of conversation about ambition and about Macbeth's drive for the crown. It's interesting to me that this moment is not about him losing his crown. The thing that stops him in his tracks is not about him losing his crown. It's not about a failure of ambition, but is actually about him losing his partner. How or do you think the relationship is between the two Macbeths throughout the play? Do you think that means anything, that it actually seems to be this moment that stops him in his tracks rather than the threat of losing his kingdom?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a massive insight into his psyche. And for me, what it was about is this steady march into isolation. And I think for me, the death of Lady M is the thing that just sends us over the edge. You know, everything else we could manage as long as I had my thought partner, my confidant, my wife beside me. We could sort of roll with whatever came our way. But this moment is the one that just, and to your point, I just want to underscore, you know, when we see Macbeth before this, he is full speed ahead, torpedoes be damned. And this, just even in the language that Shakespeare uses, is this, well, let me go back a little bit. I love this metaphor of the film version of it, because for me, that is how I thought about it. There's a cacophony of sound happening. There's a lot of things going on. And then all of a sudden, sonically, everything drops out. And we hear this man completely alone. And that's what I want to circle back to: alone. Really, truly, and finally alone. And so, in a way, we hear him talk in a way that up until now, we haven't really heard this tone before. So for me, that was something that I was very curious about, and wanted to really explore about the depths of this isolation.
That's a really interesting take on that moment. It's because one of the complaints that sometimes people will give about this play is that in the second half of it, Lady M sort of dips. Like, she has her famous out damn spot, but we're not seeing the Macbeths in partnership the way we see them earlier. But something that has always struck me is, even in the midst of the mania that is happening right before this, even though they're not active partners at this point because of what's happening to both of them, he still stops to ask that doctor two questions. The two questions are, you know, how can you cure my country, and how can you cure my wife? Mm-hmm. Which is actually a fascinating thing from a ruler. It's actually not how do I keep my country, it's how do I cure it, and mm-hmm. how do I cure my wife. So even though the complaint is that they tend to be moving apart already, the fact that he's not truly isolated until she's gone, and depending on your thoughts on suicide and some of the supernatural elements of the play, she leaves him. Mm-hmm. Like, she makes the choice to leave him, mm-hmm. which is an interesting thing, where we see him continuing to fight and she gives up, which I think is also an interesting element of that. I'm trying to think, let's take it all the way back then to the beginning of their relationship. When you were directing it, I think one of the questions that often comes up with this play is the question of the children. Mm-hmm. Did you engage with that, with their relationship, with the idea that she almost certainly has lost a child, almost certainly with him, and doesn't seem capable of having more children? Was that an active part of how you envisioned the play and their relationship, or was that sort of a side thing?
No, that was definitely one of the talking points, and spent a lot of time at the table talking about the dramaturgical impact and what does that mean now. And as I remember, you know, we look at it from a variety of angles. In a weird way, the freedom to pursue these sort of ambitious goals, not having to care for children. That was one thing I remember, you know, exploring about, like, all right, we tried, and it didn't go our way. Now we're gonna do something even bigger, better, and bolder. So I remember that definitely talking to the company about and how we view them. And I think it's easy with a 21st century lens to look at this and be like, oh no, they're a power couple. But I think you're right. I think it's a much more interesting proposition to think about what are the psychological ramifications of that, and how do you heal from something as tragic and as a profound loss as losing a child? And that's something that is, that's tough. And I think that's something for actors to really not overlook, and to always have that in the back of their sort of as they're crafting these characters. That's a psychological impact that has to be a given circumstance to really make these three-dimensional characters.
Yeah, it's even interesting to me how you described like what they choose to do instead as bigger, better, and bolder, which of course those are all comparative, which
Yeah.
means everything is to some degree being compared to, well, we can't have kids, so let's do this instead, which is, I think, a very interesting take on that piece. Are they it sounds to me like you see the relationship as very much two people who love and care for each other. There's sort of that other take where Lady M is kind of the master manipulator, but that doesn't sound like that's of much interest to you. Is that right?
That's a great question too. I had gone into it with that sort of preconceived notion, but as I got into it with the extraordinary actors, Ty Jones played Macbeth, and Rosalind Ruff played Lady M. And when you work with such high level collaborators and actors, you got to save space for what they're bringing to the table, right? And so I saw a very domestic, elastic relationship between the two. And by that I mean a profound caring for one another, but also you can be so much more. And if you would just leave aside these childish superstitions, we can live a fully realized life. And to me, that wasn't in a sort of Machiavellian sort of way. Maybe this will resonate with some of your listeners, but sometimes people who really love you or claim to love you, they're being cruel to be kind because they see there's something on the other side of it that perhaps you have a blind spot for, but they're trying everything in their power to encourage you and motivate you to a different outcome or a different path. And I remember, and not to equate the two, but there sometimes it reminded me of a parental thing. Sometimes when I was in high school and I don't want to do this and this, and you have the parent being like, no, you have to ensure your future. This is non-negotiable. You have to do this. And so here again, definitely not to equate the two, but I did find pangs of that feeling very, dare I say, maternal. But and here again, that complicates relationships when your partner, your spouse, also has a parental feeling to it that makes it complicated. And I, for one, like complicated stories and characters and texts, quite honestly.
Well, I mean, there's so much to respond to there. But first, the thing you say at the end is, I love that. Is like you drive towards whatever the most complicated choice is, not away from it. I think there's just because we have to do it so often in other parts of our lives where it's like, what's the easy solution? Let's drive towards that. But that's actually the opposite of what we have to do as artists is we have to go, what's the most impossible situation? And let's make it as impossible as possible and then try really hard to fix it and maybe fail. And it is in that turbulence that we find drama, I love that you put it in that term. It's interesting, the parental energy. I'd never really thought about it that way. I'd very much heard what you were kind of talking about being cruel to be kind. She even basically says it, right? She says I'm going to paraphrase here, but I do fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. And I also am reminded of something that my father told me once of like, never judge another couple's relationship based on the communication that you see. Because one of the great things about being in a relationship is you have such a shorthand with each other, and you don't have to be polite. You don't have to be nice. You have to have each other's back, which often means not being nice. And I love that take on Lady M, is that she's pushing him because she believes it's best for him, which makes it actually more tragic because, of course, as we find out, it's not. So, yeah, that's it's interesting. It makes me think about "Take my milk for gall, you murdering ministers," that speech at the beginning. Did you take that? I have two questions about that speech that come off of what you just said. Did you take that speech as being as literal, in that means she's still lactating, which means what this loss of child is quite recent? Did you take it that way?
Yeah, I think I did, only to make it more urgent and more with us now.
Got it. And then I was rereading it in preparation for this podcast, and I went, they don't come in that speech. The murdering murdering ministers don't come. Like I feel like the classic picture of Lady M is like this like epic woman in black, like falling to the skies as crows circle around her, and this whole thing. But then I'm like, well, she's specifically asking for all of her empathy to be eliminated. And we know it's not, because it's her empathy that drives her mad and eventually to suicide. It was something that hadn't struck me before. I was like, this is a fail. This isn't some great big thing. This is kind of a like, please come help me. Please come help me be Machiavellian. Help me be dark, because I'm not naturally this way. I don't know. Was that something that came up for you in conversation, or am I just off on some strange limb right now?
Oh, no. I think you're onto something there. That, as I remember, we had several discussions about, Lady M's trajectory and how the twists and turns. But I think you're so much. I think you're right, and it resonates because, right, what's the most interesting way to get into it? Not to come in as the hardened sort of, this is what we're doing, but you're right, to leave space for, help me
Yeah.
navigate this. And I think, as an audience member in particular, that is so satisfying. What's hard for the actor or the character makes it so delicious for the audience member to see them struggle to make sense. And I think, we don't have to go off on this tangent, but I think that's why we go to the theater, to have a better understanding about the human condition, and how could someone get from point A to point B to point C, and help us to understand that. So when you see Lady M grappling and calling to the gods, I mean, I think that is, for me, that's the money shot of the theater, really, to understand the thorny part of human nature.
Well, and I love what you're saying about theater in general, and about how, like, well, especially in today's world, kind of how can we have empathy for people who do things that we consider cruel and evil? And because there's no doubt in this play, there's no doubt that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth do many things that are cruel and evil. They become villains in this play. But it's interesting, and it's interesting watching them sort of taking each step. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. You have this sort of, she thinks murdering this one old man will bring her husband to new heights, will maybe replace the loss of not having a child. Like, she does it out of love. Strangely, I'm not sure that Macbeth really even wants it, but he sees how much she wants it, and so he does it out of love. And you sort of see these steps down. And I agree with you that I think that that's, at its core, great theater is just showing us humanity in places where maybe we wouldn't expect it. And I think it also makes me, something I've always pointed out about this play, it's not called the tragedy of Scotland. It's called the tragedy of Macbeth.
Yeah.
It is the tragedy of watching these Macbeths go from being good people to being bad people. And that I really like. I really like that. That's like, I mean, Macbeth was one of the most entertaining shows ever to watch, but still at its core, it's that whatever you just said, that was so much better phrase than I could now, about catharsis and theater, that really makes us cling to this play, is how kind of devastating it is in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And watching his self-awareness, I think, is one of the things I really took away from it, because he does know this slippery slope that he enters on while he commits these atrocities. At one time, as an audience member, it's easy to just vilify him, but that duality that exists, that you also pity the dude. So it's this duality that is just, here again, the thing the word I come back to is so delicious to watch, because there's a duality to all of us, right? It's not just the one thing. It's this two-sided coin that I think makes theater robust and interesting.
I think that's it's a great point. It was actually one that I was thinking about bringing up. Is I'm not sure there's a more insightful person making worse decisions in the canon than Macbeth. Like, most of the like true villains of the canon are just like, I'm doing this. Either it's Richard III, who's just like, I'm doing this because I'm doing this, and y'all are coming for the ride, or it's Iago, and he doesn't really let us know why he's doing it. Macbeth is like, I mean, he says it, right? If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. But in these cases, we still have judgment here. And that he knows that it's not, he knows in a way that I don't think Lady Macbeth seems to understand, which I find interesting.
Mm-hmm.
That this is not done with killing one man. That and yet he does it anyway. And that leap, and he even says, by the way, that ambition's not enough, right? I only have vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other. So what I like about what you're describing is this kind of love and connection with Lady M is what makes him take this leap into madness, even though he knows, again, in a way that I don't think Lady M does, that this is not a one and done. This is, once you take this path, you have to go. Do you agree that I want to make sure that I'm not stating something. Do you agree that he seems to have insight into that she doesn't? Or am I being reductive there?
No, I think you're onto something, because to me, the other interesting thing is, like, he keeps some of the dirt private, right? As a way to protect or shield, or to not implicate her into it, right? So I'm always interested in, what happens with Banquo. Like, what happens there? Because he says, no, I'm not going to tell you about it. It's best that you remain in the dark about this. It's like, interesting.
Yeah. That I love that he's doing that because he's protecting her, not because he's pushing her away.
Right, exactly.
And it becomes, from what you were saying earlier, I never really saw Lady M's stuff as maternal, but what's really interesting about that is that that's almost paternal. Is
Exactly.
that there's an inversion there of their relationship, which is interesting. I've always wondered if some of that is war, if some of that is that this man is a soldier and he understands the difference between murder and killing. And in a way that Lady M doesn't. Lady M's like, why would you hesitate at this? You kill people all the time. And Macbeth fundamentally understands there's a big difference between killing someone on a battlefield and killing someone in bed. And I wonder if that's just an insight that he has due to his life experience that she couldn't have, right, because of that. And so once he's gone down the murderer route, he knows he sold his soul, basically. And he says that he gave up his eternal jewel for he knows he sold his soul to do this. And yeah, the Banquo one, and also just why he decides to kill Banquo is so it's such a jump. It's like, whoa. And also kind of about kids, obviously, with, yeah. What do you, now I'm jumping around a little bit, but I'm so curious. I'm so curious about your takes on this play. So there's another thing that kind of people talk about, and I'm curious if you explored it, which is this idea of, do Macbeth and Lady Macbeth ever sleep again after killing Duncan? Because they get this disembodied voice crying out, sleep no more. And we see a lot of nighttime not sleeping coming from the two of them. And I guess I wonder if that came up in conversation for you. Like, is that part of why they start losing touch with reality? Or
I've always thought so, and for me, it's like this constant noise that just forbids sleep. You know, for me, it was always based in that the knock of the porter and getting in. So it's like this sonic landscape that, to me, continues until we get into tomorrow and tomorrow. That there's always a cacophony of sound that just prohibits sleep, right? And when we get that moment of silence, it's a moment of lucid clarity, I think, that perhaps wasn't possible, A, without the event, and B, without the noise of just everything that they've contributed ingredients to for this dish. You know what I mean? So it just prohibits sleep.
I I hadn't really thought, which is a dumb thing to have not thought. I hadn't really thought about if you're playing that like can't sleep and the cacophony as parallel, then the fact that Lady M has done the only thing she can do to be able to sleep, which is kill herself, stops the cacophony. That's a very interesting. I like that. I like that path through the play quite a lot. And obviously we see her failing to sleep, and we see him like in that second weird sister scene also kind of having a nighttime experience that isn't sleep. And it's also an odd experience I noted again in the last read through, in that he calls the weird sisters, which is the first time that happens. He conjures them. Before that, they've always been there. Which I also just find like that's an interesting change. And I don't know if that's because he's becoming more cruel, so he has more attachment to them, or whether it's he's not sleeping and hallucinating and is able to just pull them. I don't know. It's a sort of a fascinating, grim, dark sort of twist. What did you do with the Weird Sisters?
We did have them it was important for me that they had a different vocabulary physically and in their whole look. So we used dancers to embody this movement that sort of was like a the image I had was like a descending fog. And for me, it's interesting. I want to backtrack a little bit because I always had a dream logic to this play that happened, dream slash nightmare, that, it started as a dream. Wow, that's weird. And a dream logic that, wow, I just met these like non-human people who know a lot about me. So I was like, oh yeah, that is a dream sort of logic to me that then shifts into this nightmare. So here again, the weird sisters can be a different vocabulary physically was massively important to me to distinguish them of not of this world. And from there, the movements got more and more, dare I say, grotesque. That's not maybe the right word, but more heightened and more stylized as these interactions, happened.
Did you see them? It's interesting, the concept of fog. Did you see them as, how should I word this question? As manifestations of part of the Macbeth psyche, or did you see them as individual creatures with their own goals and objectives?
That's a great question. Here again, mine was rooted in dreams. So the dream lives in the subconscious and only comes to us at certain points when we're able to free our mind of sound or free our minds from other things. And that is when the dream can come in and be seen and be felt and be heard. And so for me, it had always been there, but now it just started to percolate and bubble up to the top. And once we got a sense of it, it began to mushroom further into this different space.
Well, I really like, I mean, it feels like a sort of in some ways, a deeply essential choice to the play, because in the version that you're describing, Macbeth is not manipulated. Macbeth it's his own subconscious coming out to play, perhaps inspired by grief or war or any of the things that have made him vulnerable to that. Whereas when they're external forces, they're external forces, right? Like they're manipulating or they're pushing or they're driving or whatever. And so the idea that that this is actually a psychological play trapped inside a national play is an interesting thing. Am I putting words in your mouth, or is that right?
I think that's accurate. And here again, let me preface this by saying, this was maybe 10 years ago. I
Sure.
was directing it, and that's what I was interested in at the time. Now that I have more years on me and more life experience and have dealt with different things, I would explore it potentially in a different way now, because I have different questions and different things that I'm curious about and different explorations. But at the time, that's what was fueling my artistry, those type of questions about what happens when I have even a seed of something in my mind and then I speak it. When I actually give it words and vocabulary, then does it manifest? And so for me, that was sort of the breadcrumb that led me to the idea of how this world would come into being. I think, and not to go off on a tangent, I mean, the killing of Duncan for me was one of the big ends. Because for me, I said the air is different from that moment forward. The food tastes different. The wine has somehow gotten a little sour, vinegary taste to it, and the air temperature has changed. And so those were really some of my footholds into trying to craft the world that I was particularly interested in.
I have two responses to that, one to the Duncan and then one to your larger point about where a director is at when they explore a show. I love the Duncan comment, obviously extremely tech supported with everything that happens that night. And also I'm not sure, have you had the pleasure of reading the Shapiro's Year of Lear?
No.
It's a lovely book. I would recommend it to anyone who's listening. What Shapiro does in two of his books, A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare and Year of Lear, is he just kind of tells us about the history of the time. So we understand what the play is being written out of just in terms of current events. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you know this, not sure that the audience does, is that Macbeth was written directly after the gunpowder treason and plot. Mm-hmm. And so it is not a coincidence, I don't believe, that Shakespeare wrote a play about what happens when a Scottish king is killed right after a Scottish king was almost killed. And the idea of when a holy right king is unlawfully killed, the world itself weeps, like the world itself changes. Feels very that instinct from you feels very grounded in what I'm. It's always a little bit of a mess to try to interpret why Shakespeare was writing what he was writing, but this one feels pretty one-to-one. And given he had to get it past King James censors, I'm pretty sure that there was at least some of that. So that's a very cool choice. Going back to your other point, though, I think this is a really interesting point, and one that, because I haven't had many directors on, I don't think the audience has heard much about, which is sort of this. Well, for lack of a better, the choice of interpretation, the choice of what's your take. And there's some negative elements of having to have a take or something, which I want to leave aside for a second. But something that I have very much enjoyed in all of the work of yours that I've seen is that you have a strong choice of what you want to say with a piece, but it seems to me to always be a choice that is fully grounded and supported by the text. It's not one where you're having to kind of force the text into, you're kind of having to twist the text around to get your conceit to work. And I wonder how you, because as you said, like you could picture doing a different Macbeth now with a different interpretation of the Weird Sisters. I fully buy that. I have like 3 Macbeths floating around in my head right now. How do you, as a director, I guess, check yourself to make sure that what you want to say with a piece is fully merged with what the piece is saying itself? Like that you may be offering new things, but they are fully justified by the text. Am I asking this question clearly?
I think so. And first, thank you for the kind words about that. What I would say is, years ago when I was in drama school, the big thing was always that Shakespeare was so robust that it could handle anything. And as long as you were dramaturgically sound, the work, you could find new insights into the work. And I, of course, being a troublesome kid, wanted to put those to the test. So for me, it's I try my best to have a real dramaturgically sound approach to the work in relation to the things that I'm interested in. So without tipping my hand too much, for me, that one was really the iconography was Haile Selassie, which is for some of your listeners a royal descendant in Ethiopia that many people think was anointed by God, right? And I was like, now what would happen if Haile Selassie was visiting Jamaica and was murdered? And not to reduce it to 20th century thinking, but I was like, the world would stop. And for me, that was sort of the insight and the curiosity and the itch that I wanted to scratch. So here again, going back, those were the small footholds that even that little acorn, at least for me, was able to fully realize, okay, so if we do have that, what does this sound like? What does it look like? Where are we really? And here again, not changing text, not trying to bend it or comport it or anything like that. But that was my in to the work. And here again, like I said, that was 10 years ago. Both my parents have since passed away, which has given me some existential questions that I think my artistry is lending towards now, that some of the questions I have about texts, especially Shakespearean text or Greek text or classical text, those are the type questions that just speak to my artistry now about just where I am. I went off on a bit of a tangent, but I think that
what I'm hearing to some degree is that you build your concept up from this is the text and this is the text. This is what the text says to me. These are the connections that I make to the text. Therefore, I'll build my concept up from that, as opposed to kind of trying to slap concepts on top of the idea of a story and then trying to make the text fit that, which I think is a fault to be avoided. And I've never seen any of your work that does that, obviously, but I have seen other people's work that does that. Where sometimes it feels like they're trying to tell something with the text as opposed to letting the text tell something, if that makes sense. And now I want to see your next Macbeth, though, because that kind of this play is so existential, and I'm sorry for the loss of your parents.
Thank you.
And it just immediately made me think of not that one should weaponize one's own personal experience for their artistry, but to the point earlier, sometimes artistry is the way we negotiate our own personal experiences. And I was just thinking about that moment, that very strange moment from Lady M, where she says, if he hadn't looked like my father, I'd have done it myself. It's just this sort of strange, there's some sort of deep, honest human truth inside grief in that little moment. And it does. I'm glad that you went on that tangent, because going back to what you were talking about what is theater actually about, is I do think using theater for catharsis and the exploration of grief, whether our own or others, is a hugely essential thing and takes deep courage. And so it was interesting recently. This is talk about a tangent. My grandfather passed recently, who was my longtime roommate in New York City. I had a very close relationship with him, and when we were driving to the location where he had passed, I asked my wife to just put on all the saddest musicals that she could do, because I could sing them and I could be sad in a way that I couldn't be sad just dealing with the grief. Like I needed the one step. And it was an interesting reminder of like what theater does. And I think like what Macbeth does for some people too is like we see our own grief in these two characters. And we see some of the horrors of what unhealthy grief can do. And I think Shakespeare does that better than anybody. That's my tangent. I was inspired by what you said.
Well, and back at you, condolences.
Thank you.
But here again, I think all of the things that we're talking about is the perfect place and reason why theater has survived over time and space, for those very reasons. And, my Macbeth 10 years ago would look quite different today. And I think that's the beauty of it. And I would just, to any listeners out there, if you have the opportunity to play some of these wonderful characters or direct some of these things, don't just check it off, and put a notch on your belt, dust it off again and revisit it, because you'll see. My hope is that you see it anew, because the questions are still there. These big, big, big questions that I think the classics are classics for this very reason, that they demand big questions, and they demand big understanding of life. So, again, you don't need me to beat the drum about why classical work is so important, and the work that you do at Red Bull and that we try and do at Classical Theatre of Harlem. They're here for us, and dare I say, hopefully aids to us as we navigate, as Prince so eloquently said, this tricky thing called life. And that's what they're there for.
That's lovely. And I agree. And by the way, I think it does need to be said. I think I recognize that probably the people listening to this podcast already know this. It's a little bit of preaching to the choir, but I think, as I like to say, theater, our superpower isn't intelligence, it's empathy. And these pieces that allow us to explore these incredible humans, these incredible flawed humans, are such a way for both us to explore our own empathy, and hopefully to allow audience to experience empathy themselves. And that's a lovely thing. That's such a good ending to the podcast, Carl. I have so many other questions, but I feel like that's such a good ending to the podcast. So I feel like I probably want to call it there. Maybe at some point I'll have you back on for a more like technical verse discussion, because I am curious how you explore that. But I think that it's funny how the play just does it, even in podcast form, right? Just talking about the damn play, it becomes this sort of emotional, empathetic experience, which is kind of it's a real tribute to that writer and to people who think about the pieces the way you do. So thank you so much for taking this time to be with us today. I know you are very busy with all of your jobs. Is there, speaking of such things, is there anything you want to pitch out to the listeners? That I think this will probably post in the next month or so. So if it's happening just right now, maybe don't pitch that. But anything that's coming in a month or so that you would want to pitch out to the listeners?
I would say, first and foremost, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. The work you do at Red Bull is incredible. Please, everyone listening, go out and support, see some live theater. As far as personally, a play that I'm very keen on called The 19th by Kemp Powers will be coming to Chicago. So stay tuned for all that. And then our work at Classical Theatre of Harlem. We're getting ready to announce our summer show, which I think I can give your listeners some insight. It's going to be a Shakespeare. That's what else.
Well, thank you so much, Carl. And I will also say, I hope you already know, listeners, but Classical Theatre of Harlem is doing something right now in terms of how they are able to give Shakespeare to such large audiences for free. I mean, they are living what this shit is about. So I hope you get up to see their shows, and I hope you support them, because it's really, really, first of all, it's wonderful work and incredibly entertaining, but it's also really, really important, and I will say from personal perspective, heartening that you are able to do what you are doing and offer the shows you do for free to large audiences every summer. Is really, really special. So
Thank you.
yeah, well, thank you, Carl. This was great. Thank you all for listening. Our revels now are ended. I am your host, Nathan Winkelstein, and I will see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to the Red Bull Theater Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcasting platform. Your support helps us to bring you more captivating conversations and insights into the world of classic theater. To stay updated on our latest activities, follow us on social media, get on our mailing list, and visit www.redbulltheater.com, where you'll find an abundance of podcasts, readings, classes, seminars, productions, and more. Your support makes all of this possible, so please consider making a tax-deductible donation on our website to help us continue bringing classical theater to contemporary audiences. Until next time, thanks, and ever thanks.